Last November, we were introduced to lazy history bounding. You have seen lazy history bounding skirts, but now get ready for lazy history bounding shirts. Not just a better score in Scrabble, but a brand new video from Lizcapism Productions. Prepare yourself for a history bounding experience that is lazier and shirtier. Hello, and welcome to Lizcapism. Today, we are making 4 shirts based on historical fashion in the laziest way possible. In November, I made 5 skirts this way, and that was my first lazy history bounding video. This project came out of a desire to feel as historically inspired in my casual loafing around the house clothes as I do in the clothes I would wear in public. And it seems that a lot of you felt the same. Many of you asked for other lazy history bounding clothing videos, and I was all too happy to oblige. Shirts are up next in ways to history bound casually. Stick around to see how I made the medieval t-shirt, the poet or the pirate, the laziest cardigan, and the Regency Dickie. First, a special thanks to Avery and Isabella, who are new members of my Mary Shelley Patreon tier, where among other excellent perks, you get a verbal shout-out on the next video I publish. Thanks so much to both of you. Unlike the skirts from the previous videos, these actually required a certain amount of planning ahead of time. Shirts are naturally a little bit more complex than pleating a rectangle and adding ties. So to drafting. Drafting these ended up requiring a lot of very interesting research. I had some basic rules that I was trying to follow as I brainstormed and put these shirts together, and that required looking through a fair bit of resources. Such is my love for you all. First, I wanted to have a historical garment as a reference. Every garment in this video has a historically accurate counterpart. Second, I wanted as few pieces, steps, and seams as possible. Third, as in my first lazy history bounding video, I wanted to be able to explain things without numbers or inches and centimeters. All measurements will be expressed as body parts, such as your waist measure or half your hand, etc. I drafted each item on grid paper, making note of the body measurements that would be required. This was essentially Calvin Ball, and unlike the skirts video, I had no idea if any of them would work out when I started. Thence to measuring. Welcome to the section of the episode entitled, I did not know that I still owned these pants, so ups for me, I guess. So I'm going to be measuring myself in just like a tank top and my stretchy pants, and we'll go from there. I'm using string that is actually, here, I'll see if I can show you guys. It's waxed linen string. It's made originally for bookmaking, and I don't use it for that because I don't make books. So we're going to go about the different measurements that I've laid out that I need, and I'm going to label them each with a safety pin and a little label that indicates what measurement it is, so that way we don't need numbers at any point during this video. We're going to try this. It's going to be fun. She said elegantly. All right, dear God, I hope that there's a good take in there or something. I don't talk to the camera very often. This is still hecking awkward, so we'll do some measurements now. If you need more details on how to measure yourself, I will link resources below. There is an Instagram post linked in the description that is a guide specifically to help folks whose bodies do not align with common measuring guides. If your waist, for instance, is not the narrowest point of your torso. One of the stranger body measurements that I took was the shoulder slope. That is to say the difference in height between the base of your neck and the end of your shoulder. I'll link a video which taught me how to do this. None of us are exactly symmetrical, but if you are roughly symmetrical, then one measurement will do just fine. However, if you are asymmetrical enough that it has caused problems for you in the past in terms of measurement and patterns, I recommend doing a left and right shoulder slope measurement following the same process for each side individually. I used my camera to make sure that my markings were roughly correct, but a mirror or a partner can also get this done. I was surprised by how little I had in novelty fabrics that I wanted to make into shirts, so a couple of these are actually a little bit more historical looking than I had intended them to be, so please forgive me this slight deviation from the deviation. You've already seen me wear this particular fabric. I used it to make the Herjolfsnes recreation dress in summer of 2020. Whew, that feels like a very long time ago now. My attempt with the tea tunic was to not actually have any additional gores or gussets or godes or anything like that. I only wanted 2 basic pieces, the body piece and then the 2 sleeve pieces. So in the sleeve draft, I did incorporate gores into the sleeve pattern instead of inserting them separately. And on the body, my intention was to have it begin at the shoulders and end at the hips. And this would have worked if I had made the hip measurement wide enough. I needed to insert some gores after the fact. You can see I've noticed at this point that I have messed up somewhat even on the initial measurements, and that I am going to need to add a certain amount to the bottom. Luckily, cutting diagonals on a piece of fabric usually means that you have triangular pieces left over that you can then insert as side gores. It was at this point that I started doing slight adjustments to the neckline. I find that if I do adjustments to the neckline before I've added the sleeves, the sleeve weight and shape actually affects how the neckline sits. And so while I wasn't necessarily being super exact for shape, I found that where it pulled and where it expanded the neckline and where it stretched the fabric, because this is all curves and so it's a little bit on the bias and has that little bit of stretch, I would recommend waiting until the sleeves are in before doing final neckline adjustments, just so that you can make sure that that weight and that shape isn't going to change things too much. The sleeve of your tea tunic can have a variety of shapes. The straight forward is usually the easiest way to go. That being said, one of the things that I do very much like about medieval style tea tunics is the fact that they do narrow somewhat at the sleeve, which means that they get that just little bit of extra fitting, which I think just ends up looking just a little bit more elegant, which is always fun. All of the edges of all of these garments were finished with just a turned over edge that was top stitched. Did not particularly care to do a lot of fancy finishing. Always worth noting that when you add any kind of gore to the side pieces, that is going to lengthen them somewhat, and so if you want a flat or square hemline, you can always correct that before finishing the seams. I did not care to do so. I very much like the look of the edges curling down at the bottoms. One of the things about the tea tunic, especially if you make it on the slightly looser side, which I would recommend, is when you add a belt to this particular garment, it does create a very, very impressively historical or history-boundy look that I think is just delightful. I am ready to overthrow the government with my peasant farmer sisters, and then we are ready to history bound into oblivion. The pirate or the poet shirt, which personally is one of my absolute favorites, is a variation on the tea tunic in that it is exactly the same pattern with one or two very minor exceptions. One is you increase the size of everything. Increasing the size of everything is going to make everything need to gather in order to be roughly the size that you'd like it to be, which means that you're going to get those puffy sleeves, those puffy shoulders. But the idea behind this is that the entire garment needs to billow. Man, this is just this is Liz playing the hits, isn't it? This is whoops, all former project scraps. The other thing that this garment has that the first tea tunic did not was a collar and cuffs. I had learned my lesson at this point and had created the hips to be wide enough, but I didn't narrow the shoulders nearly as much, or I don't think at all in this case. And the reason for that was that I liked that dropped shoulder look, which creates that very sort of romantic, casual effect. So cutting a similar neckline, I did a little bit of a deeper slit, given the romance of the style and given the quixotic nature of this particular garment. I'm personally of the opinion that the slit goes as far down as your modesty dictates. So I did a fairly conservative one, but only because I was going to be showing it to y'all. Of course, you can always gather by machine. A lot of people do. I find it to be extremely tiresome. Oftentimes, the lock stitch that is created by a sewing machine is harder to gather than a simple running stitch done by hand. And because we're lazy, we don't care how nicely these gathers are lining up or being distributed. If you do care, or if you have a preference, totally up to you. All of the cuffs and collars for this entire project were done in exactly the same way. We folded over all of the edges, pressed them, and then folded the length of the piece of fabric. And this is the basic model for how it was done for every single one in every single part of every single garment. The basic principle for attaching the collar to the neckline would be that you follow around the top of the neckline until you get to the slit. Something that I found is visually difficult to represent a lot of the time. With the correct amount of fabric manipulation, those slits can be made into something akin to a straight line, which makes it a little bit easier to pin. And once again, as before, we fold the garment in half along the shoulders where we had previously folded it, and then sew along each of the side seams and along the base of the sleeve. I also made a mistake in this particular case, and I forgot which side of the sleeve was going to be the top attached to the body and which was going to be the length of the thing, because I had made the whole thing quite big. So they are actually meant to be shorter with a little less gathering, but honestly, I think the effect is good either way. For the ties for this particular outfit, because it was already so slightly over the top, I felt like a little bit of glittery, shimmery ribbon yarn would not go amiss. So at first I sewed one little segment to each end of these particular cuffs. However, that turned out to be a mistake because I had made the cuffs accidentally a little bit too wide, and when I was actually tightening them, they did not tighten enough to be able to stay on while I dropped my hands. You can see that in this reveal shot, for instance, I am holding them with my hands to keep them up, otherwise they would have slipped down. This was such a cute shirt in the end. I had so much fun pretending to be a silly Shakespearean poet. In drafting the chemisette, I thought that this particular eyelet cotton would be very, very sweet, and once again I have accidentally hit upon historical adequacy. My favorite thing about the chemisette is that it is effectively the Regency equivalent of a dickie. It's not really an actual garment, it does not stand on its own, it is mimicking the behaviors of an actual garment, but having a little chemisette to wear under a sundress or something like that to wear to a slightly more formal occasion is something that I think maybe is a little bit underrated. This is something that's really open to experimentation. I wanted something that was a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more inspired by the sort of pseudo menswear that existed at the time, which I find to be a very excellent look for underclothing. So the chemisette was so very simple because I did not have to contend with sleeves and I did not have to contend with extra gussets or seams or anything like that. The drawstring at the bottom that was going to hold it to my body was going to be the thing that was going to matter. That being said, the drawstring was something that I did not take into consideration when I was doing measurements for my front. So it ended up being on the final garment just a tiny bit shorter than it was supposed to be. Mine just rides up the tiniest little bit, but honestly, it wasn't so bad, so I decided to just leave it. Channels are very, very easy to do. Just turn in your fabric a little bit to create that slightly finished edge, and then you turn up that edge a little bit more so that you've got a decent gap where you might be able to draw a thread through. I made the collar cartoonishly large in this particular case because I found that that was going to create a really interesting effect for the kind of look that I was going for. But again, this is entirely up to you if you want a cute little one, if you want to do something like a Peter Pan collar, which is fairly common. I also found that in the end, I had done some poor measuring in terms of the size of collar that I would need, and so I ended up doing some really ill-advised pleating. I would highly recommend in the future maybe just redoing the collar, but I thought I had it all under control. It ended up kind of looking a little bit weird in the end. But, you know, lesson learned, I suppose. This particular style was one where I felt like I had a little bit of flexibility because the fitting was a little bit less important on the basis that I was going to be cutting down the center front, which meant that I could have a little bit of a looser fitting or a tighter fitting, depending on whether or not I wanted it to overlap at the front when I fastened it together. I had measured my wingspan for this because I knew that I was going to be tucking in the ends of the sleeves a little bit. I chose a fabric that I knew was not going to be able to accommodate that entire arm span, and therefore I would need to make the cuffs in a contrasting fabric. The assembly of the bedgown was by far the most straightforward. All I did was attach the contrast sleeve cuffs to the main body of the fabric in the same way that I would have attached the sleeves to any of the other garments that I was doing, and then sewed up the side seams like you do. It's worth noting at this point that for this particular style, because I wanted something flowy and floppy, I opted to have the bottom hem be the same width roughly as my arm span prior to the cuffs being added. What that does create is a very sharp point at either end of the hem. For the front of this particular garment, I decided that instead of folding over the edge and finishing it that way as I had done all of the other garments, I felt like I might experiment a little with a little bit of bias tape. Now, I know that this is somewhat contrary to the lazy history bounding formula. Frankly, the hardest part of this was trying to find bias tape. This is literally the last that I could find in my stash. I think I need to go shopping. While I didn't think I was going to add a collar to this particular garment, what I ended up doing was creating a little bit of sort of bias tape, but on the straight grain, where I just edged around, and that ended up being a kind of collar for being just a little bit bigger than it needed to be, and therefore acting much in the same way that a collar would. If you would like to make more historically accurate versions of some of these items, or to see how others might have done them, I'll link some costumers below who have done excellent videos. I love this garment, and I plan to make a few more. However, through a combination of coincidence, oversight, and convergent fashion evolution, the short gown ended up having a stronger flavor of Orientalism than I would have liked. A lot of clothing, especially when simplified down to more basic component parts, ends up looking very similar to clothing from other cultures. There is something to be said for the fact that you can sort of accidentally back your way into Orientalism. Just because it's something that you did sort of unconsciously doesn't mean that somebody else might have a slightly different impression of this particular garment. So if you would like to learn about historical Asian clothing, may I direct you to the video stylings of Aura Lin and Chen Xiqiang. So that is your Lazy History Bounding Shirts edition. This one is a little bit longer and a little bit more complex, but I hope that you all understand that this is due to these shirts and not me being a perverse teacher that is sent to torture you. All of that said, I very much appreciate all of you coming and hanging out with me. A special thanks to my Patreon patrons who keep this channel going and are currently my only source of income. Let me know in the comments what kind of garments you want me to turn casual next. have a great week, and I'll see you soon.